There are secrets that bloom in broad daylight, beneath marble benches, behind whispered poetry, beside the crumbs left for pigeons. In a city that never rests, two names vanish while justice tiptoes in, uninvited. This is a tale where silence speaks louder than sirens, and truth arrives too late for comfort. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. Let me know in the comments. Settle in, because this mystery begins now. At precisely 11:45, the air inside the brownstone kitchen took on the hush of a sacred rite. Fritz was at the stove, coaxing a coil of saucisse into surrender. The aroma was robust, spiced, faintly smoky, and it drifted into the front room like a prelude to sermon. Nero Wolfe, ensconced in the dining alcove with a linen napkin unfolded over his girth and one elbow propped like a sultan, was giving the sausage his full attention. I, meanwhile, sat opposite him, not because I was hungry, though I'm never morally opposed to lunch, but because Fritz had made lentil salad with shallots, and I'd learned long ago that trying to sneak a forkful of it while Wolfe was pontificating about Alsatian cuisine was a delicate art. "Excellent," he murmured, slicing the saucisse with the gravity of a surgeon. "Fritz, you have surpassed yourself." Fritz beamed in that tight-lipped way of his and withdrew. I had about 8 more seconds of peace before the world barged in. It started with the chime, not the shrill electric ring from the hall phone, which would have been suicide at this hour, but the deeper, more civilized bell of the front door. It echoed down the hallway like a warning shot. Wolfe froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. I could see the displeasure settle across his features, like a thundercloud preparing for a downpour. I set down my own utensils with the tact of a man navigating a minefield. "No," he said, eyes still on the sausage. "Yes," I replied. "Someone's at the door." "I heard. Ignore it. If it's a delivery, they'll ring twice." The silence dared me to move. I stood, tugged at my jacket, and made my way to the hall, acutely aware that I was committing a felony punishable by glower. I opened the door. She stood there in a modest coat, hat askew, cheeks pale, and hands clutched together like someone trying to keep her bones from unraveling. Even before she spoke, I knew 2 things. She hadn't eaten, and she hadn't intended to come here. I'm sorry to intrude," she stammered. "Is this the office of Mr. Nero Wolfe?" "Technically," I said. "But practically, this is the worst possible time to confirm it. You've interrupted saucisse." Her eyes blinked in confusion. "Come in," I said. "We can ruin the mood properly indoors." She hesitated at the threshold, then stepped in with the careful terror of someone entering a confessional. "I saw a man die," she said. That was enough to pause my stride. "In Bryant Park, just an hour ago." She didn't sit until I pointed her to the red chair in the office. I walked to the dining room, steeling myself. "Wolfe," I said, "we've got a visitor. She just watched someone kick the bucket in public." He didn't even look up. Back in the office, I sat down and leaned forward just enough to look interested. "Start from the beginning," I told her. "Skip the poetry." She nodded, wet her lips. "I work at the library, the main branch on 5th. I take my lunch in Bryant Park when the weather allows. Today was clear, mild. I sat on the same bench I always do. There was a man next to me, middle-aged, reading a folder." "Did you speak to him?" "No," she said. "But then another man came by, a coffee vendor, one of those carts. The man bought a cup. Another person handed it to him. A woman, I think. He sipped and then he started shaking. He slumped forward. Just like that. Ambulance? They came, but it was too late." I watched her eyes. She wasn't rehearsed. Whatever had brought her here was raw and recent. I asked the one thing Wolfe would have. "Why come to us?" "Because the police didn't listen," she whispered. I relayed this word for word into the dining room, where Wolfe's expression hadn't moved more than a millimeter. He'd finished his saucisse and was daintily applying mustard to a second helping with the care of a man painting a miniature. He took a bite, chewed, swallowed. "Nonsense," he said flatly. That she saw it, or that it happened. That her conclusion warrants interruption. People die in public with some regularity. The human body is capricious. Arterial plaque, arrhythmias, pulmonary crises, any of these could fell a man mid-sip. But she says someone handed him the cup. Wolfe sighed like a cat facing rain. Miss, what's her name? Evelyn Drake. Miss Drake is a librarian, no doubt a conscientious one. But we are not coroners. We do not hunt coincidences with pitchforks and torches. Let her return to her books. And if she's right, then the newspapers will inform us tomorrow. Until then, pass the mustard. I could have dropped it, should have by house law. But there was something in Miss Drake's voice that nagged at me. Not the tremble, but the clarity. You don't get that kind of focus from hysteria. Back in the office, she sat upright, still gripping her handbag like a lifeline. I offered her water. She declined. Her knuckles were bone white. You said the man slumped. Was there anyone nearby? Did anyone else react? A few people screamed, she said, but no one seemed to notice the woman who gave him the cup, except me. She met my eyes. I'm not crazy, Mr. Goodwin. I believed her, which is a dangerous thing in that house. I'll talk to him again, I said. No promises. And don't be offended if he calls you an imbecile. That's his form of flattery. She blinked. He won't take your case, I added, but he may take the bait. Back in the front room, I passed the stand where Wolfe kept the Times and the Gazette folded neatly, page corners aligned like military ranks. I wasn't aiming to read them, but one headline caught my eye, buried on page 5, but still above the fold. City auditor dies in Bryant Park. Heart failure suspected. Well now. I brought the Gazette into the dining room and dropped it beside his plate like a chess clock. He glanced at it, snorted, and finished the last bite. Then he picked it up. The name, Albert Crane, city auditor, died of natural causes over lunch in the park. No mention of a coffee cup. No mention of a woman. No mention of anything unnatural, except the timing. Wolfe's jaw set, just slightly. He set the paper down with slow deliberation. His eyes narrowed, not suspicion, not outrage, just calculation. He tapped his index finger once against the rim of his plate. Archie. Yes. The young woman may wait in the front room. You mean we're not tossing her to the sidewalk? I said she may wait. I nodded. It was as close as Wolfe got to admitting interest without charging a fee. He reached for his beer, poured a slow inch into the glass, and stared at the bubbles with the intensity of a jeweler examining a floor. We will proceed, he said, with caution and distaste. And just like that, the case began. Wolfe was settled in the office chair like a boulder planted by divine authority, arms folded across the apron of his girth, chin tilted in austere disapproval. The Gazette still lay on his desk beside his glass of beer, though the foam had died in it. He hadn't touched the glass since the young woman left. You wish, he said, to indulge your constitutional craving for movement. I wish, I corrected, to take a walk to Bryant Park and ask a few well-phrased questions. If Albert Crane had a heart failure in public, I'd like to know which artery cooperated. Wolfe snorted. I would prefer not to invite attention to this establishment. You'd prefer the sun didn't rise, I said. We're past the point of polite distance. You told Miss Drake she might wait. That means something. He gave me a glance, the sort you'd give to a beetle doing the cha-cha. Very well, he said. Satisfy your itch for exercise. Do not be photographed, quoted, or clubbed. And, Archie, no flamboyance. I tipped my hat and departed with all the flamboyance I could legally carry. Bryant Park had the same look it always did in early spring. Benches arranged like bored spectators, pigeons pretending not to be predators, and clusters of men around the chess tables working out their egos over bishops and pawns. But the cordon still hung at the east side, a single strand of police tape fluttering in the breeze like a loose ribbon on a crime too tidy to honor it. A uniformed cop stood at the perimeter, doing the usual dance of ignoring the curious, while looking bored enough to wish for another corpse. I took a lap around the benches, nodding here and there like I belonged, which I can usually manage without a badge. The spot wasn't hard to find, a gap in the park's rhythm, a patch of grass too neatly trampled, like a footnote left out of a page. People were already forgetting, but someone had seen something. Someone always does. I spotted the first likely candidate by the coffee cart near the East Fountain. White cap, narrow eyes, and the jawline of a man who never throws away a napkin. Black, no sugar, I said, offering a coin. Unless you've got murder in a paper cup. The vendor, who wore a name tag that said Charlie, raised one brow but poured without comment. Heard about that guy, I added, nodding vaguely toward the benches. Dropped dead with a latte in hand. Charlie sniffed. Wasn't a latte. No. Straight drip. Colombian. Regular order. I let him keep talking. With some people, you don't need to ask questions. You just lean slightly forward and blink at the right time. Saw him here plenty, Charlie said. Name was Crane, someone said. Worked in an office somewhere. Always came alone. Usually read a file while he sipped. Today was different. Today he was handed the cup. Didn't take it from me. That raised my left eyebrow. A woman brought it over. Brunette, classy coat, green hat. Handed him the cup, smiled, walked off. Next thing I knew, people were screaming and he was flat on the bench. Still have the cup? He shook his head. Gone. Police couldn't find it. I think someone took it. He didn't say who. He didn't need to. I was about to press Charlie for more when a shadow loomed over my shoulder and cleared its throat with the subtlety of a trumpet in a phone booth. That's enough, said the uniform. You with the press? Only if it's Fashion Week. He didn't laugh. Most don't. You're crowding an active scene. I'm standing on a sidewalk in a public park drinking coffee and chatting about current events. You're interfering. Am I wearing a trench coat and asking for your badge number? That earned me a glare and a second throat clearing that could have melted enamel. But as he pointed his thumb westward, I glanced at the report slip peeking from his pocket. It bore one line in blocky pen. Heart failure presumed. No foul play. Presumed. That's a beautiful word. It means we don't know and don't want to. I tipped my hat to the officer, nodded to Charlie, and backed off with the grace of a man who had heard what he came to hear. I found the park attendant near the trash bins, unlocking a green metal can with a ring of keys and the weariness of someone who'd already emptied too many stories today. He looked up when I approached, not unfriendly, just resigned. You're not a cop, he said. I get that a lot. I'm a freelance asker of questions. I specialize in forgettable events and unforgettable details. He almost smiled. Almost. I didn't see much, he said. The guy fell over. Everyone screamed. Looked like a stroke. Anyone leave the scene unusually fast? The man hesitated. I waited. There was a fellow in a tan coat, middle-aged, hat pulled low. He walked away like he was late for a meeting. Carrying anything? Newspaper, folded once, tucked under his arm. He shrugged. Probably nothing. Probably, I said. But when a man leaves a public death with the day's headlines tucked tight, it's usually because he doesn't want to be part of tomorrow's. I was halfway through a mental catalogue of tan coats when I heard the unmistakable sound of thunder dressed in a rumpled suit. Inspector Kramer does not believe in coincidence, subtlety, or me. He spotted me before I spotted him, which I admit is rare. You, he said. Me, I confirmed. You're not cleared to question anyone on this. I wasn't questioning. I was lounging. I saw you at the vendor and the attendant. Then you know I'm good company. He came closer, squinting. If Wolfe's sniffing around this one, he isn't. He better not be. I've got enough grief with City Hall. The last thing I need is Wolfe handing theories to the press over stewed duck. I'll try to keep him on a leash. You've got a leash? It's metaphorical. He grunted. Tell Wolfe, he said. If I see his name in the papers, I'll send him something special. Bouquet? Subpoena. He stomped off before I could ask about card or ribbon. By the time I reached a payphone, my shoes had swallowed enough park dust to qualify as botanists. I dropped a coin and dialed the brownstone, already composing the opening line in my head. Fritz answered, transferred me. Wolfe came on with the warmth of glacial drift. Yes? Cup's gone, I said. Vendor says it never made it to evidence. Our friend Crane was handed the drink by a woman in a green hat. Vanished. Also, a man in tan left fast, carrying a newspaper like a getaway pass. Silence. Autopsy marked heart failure before the results were even processed. More silence. Kramer says if he sees your name in the papers, he'll mail you a valentine with teeth. A breath on the line. Then, I see. That was Wolfe's version of a full-blown operatic aria. I'll return shortly, I said. He didn't say goodbye. He just hung up, which, in Wolfe, is practically a proposal of war. I crossed Fifth Avenue with the paper under my arm and the wind stiffening my coat collar. The air was turning colder, or maybe it was just the fact that I felt eyes behind me. I don't rattle easy, but I know when a gaze hangs. Too long, and I don't like echoes when I walk. I looped once around the park, doubled back near the public restrooms, and caught a flicker of movement. Tan coat, quick step, head down. It could have been a coincidence. Then again, so could Crane's heart attack. I kept walking, letting the city fold in around me, its noise and rhythm masking the click of the trap Wolfe had already begun to bait. The game was on, and the silence behind me was louder than anything else. The cafe was a narrow corner joint half a block from the library, with chrome chairs and coffee that had ambitions of being European. Evelyn Drake sat stiffly at a table by the window, both hands wrapped around her cup like she was trying to warm them, though the radiator behind her was hissing like a snake with sinus trouble. She spotted me, straightened, and attempted a smile that gave up halfway. "I'm sorry," she said as I slid into the seat opposite. "I shouldn't have involved Mr. Wolfe." "You shouldn't have," I agreed. "But since you did, you might as well keep doing it." That got a ghost of a smirk. I thought maybe it was nothing. Maybe I imagined it. But the more I think about it, Mr. Goodwin, I know what I saw. She leaned in. He didn't take the coffee from the cart. A woman handed it to him. She wasn't just being polite, it was deliberate. "Describe her," I said. Evelyn's eyes didn't waver. She was beautiful, composed, and she wore a green hat I can't stop seeing. "She stood near the cart," Evelyn said, her voice low. "But she didn't order anything. She was already holding the cup when she approached Mr. Crane." "Crane," I repeated. "Yes, I recognized him. He used to come into the library, City Records Division." "Go on." She walked up to him like they knew each other. She didn't smile, not really. She said something I couldn't hear and handed him the cup. Then she turned and walked away. Not rushed, not nervous. Calm, like it was routine. I let that hang a moment. "You'd recognize her again?" She nodded slowly. The coat was navy, belted. Her gloves matched. But it was the hat. Dark green felt, wide-brimmed, with a black ribbon. Stylish, not flashy. The kind you remember. I stirred my coffee and kept my eyes on hers. "And you're sure he drank from it immediately?" "Yes. 2 sips, maybe 3, and then he stiffened." "And no one else noticed?" "Not the woman. Just the collapse." Evelyn shivered. "I don't know who she is, but she knew what would happen." That made 2 of us who wanted her name. We stepped out into a soft drizzle that made the sidewalk shine like a nickel with a secret. Evelyn pulled her coat tight, and I walked her east toward Fifth. I wasn't in a hurry, but I wasn't dawdling either. Something about the air felt off. Not weather, not noise, movement. We passed a storefront with a plate glass window. I glanced sideways, not at us, but at the reflection behind us. A man stood across the street, half turned, just too still to be waiting for a bus. I guided Evelyn a little closer. "Recognize him?" I asked. She shook her head. "Should I?" "No," I said, "but he's certainly interested in you." We took a corner, then another. His pace didn't change, but his silhouette kept returning like punctuation in a long sentence I didn't like the tone of. Evelyn's steps got smaller. "Is he following?" "He's pretending not to, which is worse. Let's get you in a cab." She didn't argue. Smart girl. The first yellow cab I flagged stopped like it owed me money. Evelyn slipped in, and I gave the driver an address on West 82nd. Fiction, but close enough to real to get us moving. In the mirror, the man in tan flagged his own ride. I didn't need binoculars to guess where it was headed. "Take a left at 47th, I said, sliding a bill forward. "Then head west like the meter's allergic to Midtown." We snaked through Times Square in a way no tourist cab ever did, and by the time we reached 8th, the tail was gone. Evelyn glanced back, tense. Was that necessary? "Only if you enjoy not being followed." She gave a small, shaky laugh. "I don't think I do." I let the silence ride with us a minute before redirecting the cab back downtown. This time, I used an address that wouldn't surprise Wolfe, assuming he was still speaking to me after all this extracurricular effort. Which he would be, the moment I gave him a name. The brownstone was quieter than usual when I got back. Wolfe had disappeared into the orchid rooms, leaving the office to the tick of the wall clock and the smell of Fritz's afternoon bread cooling on the sill. I went to the files. Not ours. Wolfe's were sacred. But the municipal rosters we kept for reference. City employees, departmental staff, public records. Not thrilling reading unless you were the sort of person who dreamed in filing codes, but I wasn't in it for thrills. The name I was hunting was Clara Renwick. It took 20 minutes and one sore elbow, but there she was. Administrative Secretary to Commissioner Marcus Lathrop. Address in Murray Hill. Civil status, single. Years of service, 6. Bingo with frosting. I closed the drawer and sat back. If Crane had been nosing around the commissioner's books and Renwick had delivered a poisoned cup in a public park, we were looking at more than jealousy or freelance vengeance. We were looking at something with legs. Wolfe wouldn't like it, which meant I had to go tell him. He was in the plant room when I found him, deadheading a Laelia anceps with surgical precision. I waited until he finished the snip before I spoke. "I've got a name," Wolfe grunted. "Clara Renwick, secretary to Marcus Lathrop. She matches Evelyn's description down to the gloves and the hat." Wolfe snipped again. She handed the coffee to Crane. Then disappeared. "And the police?" "Haven't said a word. No public notice of a suspect. No sign they know she exists." He turned to look at me. His eyes were half-lidded, but the weight behind them was shifting. "Commissioner Lathrop," he said. "The same who froze the transit budget in January and reallocated funds to infrastructure maintenance. You've been reading the editorial page again. I remember what matters." He turned back to the orchids. "This will not be simple," he said. "Political entanglements stain logic faster than ink on linen. We must tread lightly." "Should I take off my shoes?" He didn't bother replying, which meant, proceed, but with caution, and bring disinfectant. Downstairs I went to the press files. Most were fluff, ribbon cuttings, community awards, official banquets, but tucked inside a manila envelope marked Lathrop was the photo I needed. City Hall ceremony last November. Lathrop at center, eyes like buttons. Beside him, 3 aides, and just to his right, a tall woman in a tailored coat, dark hair swept back, green hat slightly tilted. She wasn't smiling. She didn't need to. I held the picture up to the light. Evelyn Drake's memory had earned a gold star. Clara Renwick, right hand to power, calm, controlled, and, If Evelyn was right, lethal. I slipped the photo into a fresh folder and walked back toward the office, already hearing Wolfe's voice in my head. Yes, Archie, you have confirmed the inevitable. Let us now prepare for the impossible. What he'd say in person would be longer and less complimentary. But he'd say it, and that meant one thing. He was in. I found Wolfe in the plant rooms, that steamy green sanctum where crime is forbidden and even curiosity enters only with a passport. He was standing with one hand behind his back, the other hovering delicately near a pot of Odontoglossum citrusmum, studying its bloom with the gravity of a bishop inspecting incense. The contrast between that room and the world outside was enough to make your head spin. Inside, rows of orchids living lives of obedient perfection, each blossom arranged by genus, species, and Wolfe's iron will. Outside, auditors dropping dead in parks, women in green hats handing out lethal coffee, and city officials whose records were as neat as a spiderweb. Fritz arrived with Wolfe's evening bottle and glass on a tray, bowed, and disappeared. The beer was poured with the same reverence he gave to roast squab or saucisse maison. Wolfe did not glance at it. He continued to stare at the flower as if it owed him money. Without moving his eyes from the orchid, Wolfe said, "The peril of civic virtue is that it attracts scoundrels faster than public office attracts flies." I leaned a hip on the low marble shelf near the misting valve. "You don't say." "They wrap themselves," he continued, "in banners labelled reform, oversight, budget integrity. It is the last and cheapest refuge of private greed. When a man begins proclaiming transparency, Archie, check for the stain on his ledger." I knew better than to interrupt. This wasn't idle pontificating. When Wolfe's philosophy started dripping like honey from a teaspoon, it usually meant he'd spotted a pattern he hadn't finished naming yet. Just as a gardener, he went on, may hide blight under a fresh layer of mulch, so too does a commissioner bury theft beneath fiscal reviews and infrastructure reports. What appears immaculate often reeks beneath. "I'll let the mayor's office know they've got root rot," I offered. That earned me a look, which, in that room, bordered on sacrilege. "Don't tell me," I said. "You've caught religion and taken up poetry. Shall I fetch a quill?" Wolfe turned to me slowly, like a cruise ship making a difficult turn in shallow waters. "I am not poetic," he said coldly. "I am observant. There is a distinction. The poetic imagines decay. The observant confirms it. That auditor in the park, Crane, he was your muse?" "No, he was an inevitability. A symbol, if you like." "You just said you weren't poetic." He gave a short snort, somewhere between derision and disdain. "The manner of his death was public, the cause, allegedly private. That is contradiction. Unless it was just his ticker giving out." Wolfe shook his head. "Too convenient. Too soon. The police leapt upon it like a child on a sweet. Maybe they're just efficient." That would be novel. He returned to the bench near the Cattleya hybrids and sat, his movement as precise as if choreographed. "It is axiomatic," he said, "that public officials do not die by coincidence while investigating money trails." I stayed where I was. When Wolfe gets declarative, the best move is silence with eyebrows raised. "Albert Crane," he said, "was a mid-level auditor with a reputation for thoroughness and no reputation for temperament. He had recently been assigned to a discretionary review of civic maintenance disbursements, unannounced and internal. Translation? Someone asked him to look at where city funds were truly going. I suspect the request came from within his department, but not above it." I nodded. "And you think someone didn't like what he found?" "I think someone liked it too much and feared what he would say. His death was not impulsive, nor was it passion. It was an interruption. Efficient, quick, almost surgical." "Then what about the woman with the green hat?" "That," Wolfe said, "is the thread. If it leads back to City Hall, the rot will be structural." Wolfe reached for the glass Fritz had left and took a sip, the beer vanishing into his mouth as solemnly as a vow. "I want you," he said, "to gather everything, press clippings, internal memos, personnel directories, on two men. Names? Albert Crane and Marcus Lathrop." I blinked. "The commissioner?" "Precisely. You think he killed Crane himself? I think either he is the architect of a concealed operation, or he is its unwitting benefactor. One of them was too honest. The other, perhaps, too content. Which is worse?" Wolfe set down his glass with care. "I shall wait for the evidence to answer that question. But I require facts. Pull every thread. Start with fiscal year summaries and interdepartmental memos. You know those things make my teeth itch. Then chew carefully." As I turned to go, Wolfe didn't rise. He sat, fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded, letting the orchids murmur around him. The air was thick with humidity and floral scent, but beneath it was something colder. A focus so absolute it stilled the room. He'd already begun unraveling the logic. I'd seen that look before, when the facts were assembling themselves behind his forehead, and he hadn't yet decided whether to pity the fool or crush him. There was nothing more to be said. The game had moved from rumour to reason. I stepped out of the room without a word, leaving Wolfe with his blossoms and his thoughts. Back in the office, I grabbed the notepad and reached for the file cabinet. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen mingled with the distant ticking of the wall clock. Behind me, I heard Wolfe's chair creak faintly, then the soft clink of his beer glass on wood. He muttered something in Latin, probably Virgil or Cicero, or a curse on city bureaucracy, and I caught just enough of it to translate. Truth, like mildew, thrives best in the dark. I didn't disagree, but I intended to bring a flashlight. City Hall's third floor had the kind of marble corridors that made your shoes sound like accusations. I'd worn my quietest pair, but even they seemed to echo like a gavel. The place smelled like fresh varnish and suppressed guilt, two things that rarely appeared on the same memo. I was there under the noble pretense of routine follow-up from a licensed investigator, which is to say I waived my ID, asked questions with a straight face, and dodged the kind of answers that come dressed as shrugs. Clerks glanced up and then down, the way people look at a storm cloud with their name on it. No one wanted to talk about Albert Crane, or what he'd been auditing before he died. I got the kind of evasion you usually reserve for tax season or mother-in-laws. But if bureaucracy's good at anything, it's hiding things in plain sight. One kid, freckles, ink on his sleeve, and all the subtlety of a subway horn, blinked too hard when I asked about missing reports. That twitch meant something. So I smiled, leaned in, and got ready to press where it hurt. The audit reports on Albert Crane's last assignment were, to put it charitably, experiencing a sabbatical. The index said they should be filed under maintenance oversight, contractual irregularities, third quarter. The shelf said otherwise. One clerk, older than Roosevelt's first term and about as enthusiastic, claimed they were sent for duplication. Another swore they'd been reallocated to records. That's governmentese for, we burned them and ate the ashes. I was about to write off the whole visit as a marble-scented waste when the kid with the nervous eyelids slipped me a note folded like a high school love letter. It had a single name scribbled in pencil: Commissioner Marcus Lathrop. No context, no signature. Just the name, as if that alone should rattle the furniture. I tipped my imaginary hat, smiled at no one in particular, and strolled out with the kind of purpose that gets noticed. The name Lathrop wasn't new. He was the sort of city official who never made headlines. He made them disappear. Back on the sidewalk, the chill was sharper. Either the wind had picked up, or I was getting close to something that knew how to bite. Calloway picked the diner, one of those unambitious joints near Madison Avenue with formica counters and bad jazz whispering through a speaker no one asked for. He was already in the booth when I walked in, stirring coffee like it owed him rent. "Nosy morning, Goodwin," he muttered, eyes on the sugar canister. I slid in across from him. "Just window shopping for municipal corruption." He didn't smile. Calloway never did when the wind smelled like headlines and funerals. He leaned in slightly, voice low. You should tell Wolfe to steer clear of Lathrop. That man's got a long memory and a short fuse. Cute pair. I sipped. It tasted like regret with a hint of dishwater. Crane's audits got ghosted. You think Lathrop pulled the strings? Calloway didn't answer. Instead, he fished in his coat for a matchbook, lit a cigarette, and stared past my shoulder like he was watching someone make a mistake. Just don't dig too hard, he said finally. There's dirt here that bites back. I left the coffee untouched. He left his warning like a calling card, and suddenly the city felt a little tighter around the edges. Before I could push Calloway any further, he dropped his cigarette in the ashtray, muttered, "Take care," and slid out of the booth like a man on borrowed time. I followed him with my eyes through the smudged glass window. He didn't walk fast, but his posture had gone stiff, as if he knew something was watching. That something turned out to be a man in a grey overcoat, tall, plain, and forgettable in the way hired muscle is trained to be. He peeled off from a lamppost and fell into step behind Calloway with all the subtlety of a bass drum. Just before exiting, Calloway had let one more phrase drop. Crane's memo mentioned diverted funds, maintenance contracts, big ones. He hadn't said more. He hadn't needed to. The smell of a threat lingers longer than cheap cologne. I didn't follow. If Calloway was being tailed, adding a third wheel wouldn't help him. But I made a mental note. Wolfe would want that name, that memo, and maybe that overcoat too. Because when shadows start trailing reporters, you don't wait for a second act. You dig, or you burn. It was past 9 by the time I made it back to the brownstone. The street was hushed, the kind of quiet that doesn't come from peace, but from something holding its breath. Inside, the usual warmth was absent. The hall light flickered once before going dim. Fritz met me in the foyer, face drawn, apron spotless, but clutched like a flag of distress. There was someone here, he said. About an hour ago. I smelled something. I raised a brow. Something like. He hesitated. Like orchids, but wrong. Chemical. The scent lingered. Sweet, earthy, but with an undertow of something sharp. Not poison, not quite, but not Fritz's doing either. Wolfe hadn't stirred from the office yet. The orchid rooms were his sacred chapel, and an unsolicited visitor was equivalent to vandalizing the Sistine ceiling with a crayon. Fritz and I moved down the hall together, quiet as remorse. The lock to the basement stair looked off, just a hair crooked. I didn't say anything. Not yet. But in my gut, something cold had taken a seat and ordered a drink. We descended to the orchid rooms with the kind of caution you reserve for live wires or jealous husbands. Fritz flicked the light. The damage wasn't grand, just precise enough to rankle Wolfe's blood pressure. 3 pots tipped over, 1 heating coil out of alignment, a sliver of paper crushed under a rubber heel. But the lock on the inner door had been forced. Clean snap, professional, not panicked. This wasn't a burglary, it was a message. Fritz bent to set a pot upright, fingers trembling. Nothing is missing, he said. But they touch things. That they wasn't plural, but it might as well have been a declaration of war. I picked up the crushed paper. It had once been a packet, fertilizer probably. Now it was a smear with no name. We stood there a moment in silence. Fritz adjusting leaves like a mother fixing a child's collar. Me holding a broken lock in one hand, trying to decide whether to say, "They'll pay," or just let Wolfe do it for me. Behind us, on the stairs, I heard the creak of weight. Wolfe was coming. And someone, somewhere was about to discover what sacrilege really meant. He didn't storm in. Wolfe never stormed. He descended like a thundercloud trying on diplomacy. One look around the orchid rooms, and the temperature dropped 5 degrees. Fritz stepped back. I didn't. Someone had to be the lightning rod. Wolfe surveyed the damage, nostrils flaring. He picked up one of the upended pots, examined it as if it had confessed, then let it drop back with a clink. "This," he said, voice low and poisonous, "is insolence." I nodded. "Clean entry, nothing stolen, just your pride and Fritz's temper." Wolfe's eyes pinned me. They broke sanctuary, Archie, the sanctity of ordered growth, of cultivated excellence, defiled by some imbecile with a crowbar. He turned toward the stairs. "This is no longer professional, it is personal. The matter is no longer merely one of death, but of contempt." That might have been the most dangerous sentence I'd heard all month. He paused. "We will respond. Not with bluster, with precision." That was Wolfe's version of drawing a sword, and whoever had broken that lock had just stepped into the duel. Back in the office, Wolfe sat like a stone Buddha who'd read too many newspapers and lost all tolerance for fools. He dictated. Names, numbers, movements, orders for Saul, Fred, and Ori, surveillance patterns, hotel lobbies, unlisted garages. I took it all down, the clack of my typewriter the only sound in the room. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't pace. He simply planned. Because when Nero Wolfe moves against you, you won't hear the thunder, just the rain that follows. And tonight, the clouds were gathering. It was 6:57 a.m. when the AP ticker coughed out the kind of thing that makes your spine tighten, even if your breakfast eggs haven't. I was still in my socks, mug of coffee in one hand, flipping through the early edition of the Gazette, when the machine on the far desk rattled like it had a conscience to clear. Ned Calloway, veteran crime columnist, found shot in his office, it said. I blinked, reread, and then checked the timestamp. 37 minutes ago. Problem was, last I knew, nobody had called in the stiff, which made that wire beat the badge by a good hour, maybe more. I slid into my shoes and dialed the precinct. Nobody had heard a peep. Either the wire service had grown clairvoyant overnight, or someone had handed them the scoop before the body hit rigor. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was going to be one hell of a headline too soon. I grabbed my coat and left the brownstone with the kind of feeling that Wolfe would call intellectually suggestive. By the time I pushed open the glass doors of the Evening Ledger, the newsroom had all the ambience of a funeral parlor run by nervous squirrels. Typewriters stood frozen mid-thought, editors whispered in clumps, and a couple of junior reporters were smoking like it was a competitive sport. Calloway's office, glass-walled, messy, and unforgivably yellow-lit, was cordoned off with 2 chairs and a rolled-up fire escape plan. Inside, Ned Calloway himself sat hunched at his desk, like he'd fallen asleep proofreading obits, except for the part where his temple had been ventilated. The revolver lay on the blotter next to his right hand, like a statement nobody had asked for. I didn't need the blood on the floor or the look on the managing editor's face to know that Ned wasn't doing any rewrites. Kramer was already there, poking around like a terrier in a tulip bed. He looked up and grunted. "Thought you'd sniff this one out," he muttered. "Lucky. Guess," I said. "Or maybe I read it in the paper." The joke didn't land. It never does when the body's still warm and the narrative smells off. I was standing just inside the office, doing the kind of peripheral scan Wolfe pretends not to believe I'm good at, when one of Kramer's men peeled a piece of paper from Calloway's stiff fingers. He handed it to Kramer without ceremony. Just a note, torn from a reporter's pad, written in blocky script, like someone pretending they had something to hide. Evelyn Drake. No context, no verb, just a name sitting on the page like a thrown gauntlet. Kramer read it, frowned like he'd been personally insulted, then slid it into his pocket without a word. The temperature in the room, which had already been somewhere around tense, dropped a few notches. He caught my eye and held it. "You want to tell me why your pal Miss Drake would be on a dead man's note?" "No," I said. "But I'd like to ask her myself before you go writing the ending," he snorted. "I'm getting tired of you playing tour guide, Goodwin." And I was getting tired of crime scenes that came with headlines already printed. You know that moment in a bad play where the lead actor forgets his line, but keeps talking anyway? That was Kramer with the law. He barked an order to his man, who grabbed his hat like it owed him money. "Pick up Evelyn Drake," Kramer said. "Bring her in. Murder 1. I took a step forward, not too close but close enough to remind him I wasn't a secretary with a notebook. "That's a neat move, Kramer. Real tidy. But what's the motive? Professional jealousy? Blackmail? Love gone sour on a deadline?" His jaw flexed like he wanted to chew the words before spitting them. "You've seen the note. She had the motive and the access. Calloway wrote about her 2 weeks ago, didn't he?" "He wrote about everyone 2 weeks ago. Maybe she didn't like her column inches." It was thin as tissue paper, and we both knew it. But Evelyn had 2 things working against her: looks and history. People are quick to connect lipstick and gunpowder. I could have kept arguing, but Kramer was already halfway to the exit, coat snapping like a judge's robe. He was arresting the headline, not the killer. I called Wolfe from the hallway outside the bullpen, pacing between 2 vending machines that smelled like despair and fake cheese. The line crackled once before his voice came on, precise, slow, and unmistakably disinterested. "She's not guilty," I snapped, "unless your definition of guilt includes being convenient for public consumption." "I see," he said. Just that. 2 words. Not even a grunt of annoyance. "You see what?" I growled. "A woman's being railroaded, the murder weapon's playing possum, and Calloway's corpse is running a news cycle before it cools. Any thoughts?" I refrained from impulsive conclusions. "Which means what?" "Which means," Wolfe said, "that if I say more, you will act rashly. I prefer you irate and observant." He hung up. I stared at the receiver for a second before jamming it back into the cradle. Back in the squad room, Kramer was polishing his ego and pretending it was evidence. And me? I had a gut full of questions and a boss who liked to let the stew simmer. You can tell a lot from a gun, even when it's not saying much. I was standing by Kramer's evidence cart like a bored usher at a bad opera, watching the lab boys do their dance. The revolver, now safely bagged and tagged, sat on a tray like a tired prop. It was too clean. Fingerprints only on the grip, none on the trigger, cylinder, or even the barrel. Calloway had been shot from a range that left powder burns, but the casing was laid out like it had been placed there by a guy with tweezers and stage fright. You don't need Wolfe's orchids to smell artificial. The whole scene stank of rehearsal, but Kramer wasn't sniffing. He was nodding at reports and feeling like Solomon. I jotted a few notes in my book. Not for Wolfe, not yet. For me. Because whoever planted that revolver wasn't just sloppy. They were arrogant, and that meant they'd leave another fingerprint, somewhere. By the time I made it back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the plant room with a spray bottle and the look of a man trying to ignore the outside world. I didn't knock. I just said it. "They booked Evelyn. No bail." He didn't look up. Expected. "You going to keep pruning geraniums while the city files women under miscellaneous?" His hand stopped, just for a second, then resumed. "You noticed the fingerprints," he said, not a question, "and the shell casing, and the note with her name and no punctuation." He finally turned. His face had the same expression he reserves for badly proofed menus. "This is not merely injustice, Archie. It is ineptitude paraded as logic. It insults the intelligence." I waited. Then, finally, "Very well. We will act." It was the Wolfe equivalent of rolling up sleeves and shouting from rooftops. "I will not pursue the identity of the killer," he said. "I will pursue the necessity of fabrication." Which was Wolfe talk for. Someone wanted this lie very badly, and now they'd have to want something else. Survival. We reconvened in the office, as ritual demanded, with 2 cold bottles of Horseman's, and a silence that tasted like momentum. Wolfe poured, sipped, and settled. "You will go to Bryant Park," he said, "and look for the silence beneath noise. Clara Renwick, if she is what I suspect, will not refuse you." "And if I bait a hook?" I asked. He nodded. Make it glint. I leaned back, let the cold beer slide down and the wheels spin. Because Wolfe wasn't hunting a killer. He was hunting the motive that needed two deaths, Calloway's and Truth's. And I was holding the bait. Wolfe had a talent for silence that could make a metronome self-conscious. He sat behind his desk, fat fingers stroking the edge of a thick, cream-coloured envelope, as though he were tuning it for tone. The words, "Audit Draft," "Confidential," were written across the front in his own unmistakable calligraphy. That meant it was bait fit for kings or killers. "You will carry this," he said, sliding it toward me with the same delicacy a priest might reserve for communion. Casually, not carelessly. The illusion must suggest competence, not cunning. I leaned forward. "And if someone decides to make it their afternoon reading, permit it," he said, "to a point." The plan, as he explained it, would have sounded crazy if it hadn't come from Nero Wolfe. Bryant Park, mid-afternoon. One envelope, one decoy conversation, and one criminal ego too arrogant to resist its own reflection. "You trust me to improvise?" I asked. He raised one eyebrow, that imperial semaphore of his. "No. I trust you to behave like yourself. The danger lies in that you do it too well." There's something about returning to the scene of a murder that feels both theatrical and stupid, like applauding after the curtain's already fallen. But Wolfe's instructions didn't include protest clauses, so Bryant Park it was. I dressed down, brown tweed, worn hat, a tie that had seen better decades, and strolled across the lawn with the envelope tucked under my arm like the world's most boring love letter. The air had that faint September chill that makes the city seem more honest than it really is. A few chess players were locked in silent combat under the trees, and pigeons held their usual union meeting near the benches. I bought a newspaper, opened it halfway, and found the same line about Ned Calloway's tragic suicide. The ink was barely dry, but the lie was old already. I picked a bench with a good view of the coffee stand and the eastern path. Wolfe's plan depended on movement, mine, Clara's, and the unseen somebody with enough nerve to reach for the envelope. I settled in and waited, feeling the city hum like a cat about to pounce. The coffee vendor spotted me before I got within 5 feet of him. "Hey, you again," he said, wiping his hands on a towel that looked as though it had fought in 2 wars. "Back for more caffeine or more trouble?" "Depends what's brewing," I said. "Any new faces around since the park made the papers?" He laughed. "You kidding? Reporters, cops, gawkers, half of them buying coffee just to look innocent." I paid for a cup and leaned on the counter. "Say, you remember that guy, Crane, the auditor? Word is he was onto something big before he croaked. Might be someone wants to keep that file from coming out." The vendor's eyes darted once to the benches, then back to me. "You shouldn't talk about that stuff out loud." "Why not? It's just coffee talk." He looked past me, and I followed the gaze. Nothing special. Just a few office types on lunch break. But one of them was wearing gloves. In September. I thanked him for the refill and walked away slow, the envelope visible and the hook in the water. It started like all bad ideas do, with a pretty woman and too much confidence. Clara Renwick appeared from the far side of the park, dressed in navy again, hat tilted just so, the green felt catching sunlight like it had an alibi. Her stride was unhurried, deliberate. I could almost hear Wolfe's voice in my head. "Observe the economy of motion. Guilt is never so calm." She stopped near my bench, smiled as if we'd met by accident, and said, "Mr. Goodwin, isn't it? From Mr. Wolfe's office?" "Depends who's asking," I said. "I only wanted to express my condolences," she said smoothly. "For that poor man, the reporter. Such a tragedy. Suicide, they're calling it." Her eyes flickered, one heartbeat no more. "So they are." Her gaze drifted down to the envelope under my arm. "Still running errands for your employer?" Always, I said. This one's dull. Just an old audit draft. Hardly front-page material. She smiled again, but her eyes had gone colder. You'd be surprised what can make the front page, Mr. Goodwin. She wasn't wrong. I let her do most of the talking, which is a rare event in my life. Clara Renwick was good, poised, faintly amused, and entirely too rehearsed. I heard, I said, lowering my voice, that Callaway was about to publish something on the city's maintenance contracts, money vanishing like cream in a politician's coffee. You ever hear of that? She laughed lightly. Rumours. People invent stories when a man dies. Maybe, I said. But some stories come with footnotes. There's even talk of an envelope, one that might have held an early memo from Crane's audit. I tapped the corner of mine against my knee. Not too obvious, just enough. For a moment, she looked directly at it, then away again. A professional wouldn't have flinched, but she wasn't a professional at this game. Mr. Goodwin, she said, you should be careful carrying things that don't belong to you. That's sound advice, I said, and you should be careful offering it. Her lips curved, but her hand drifted to her purse, and her eyes made a small, sharp motion to the left. Across the lawn, a man in a grey suit began moving, slow, deliberate, converging. Out on 42nd Street, parked just far enough from the curb to look unimportant, sat a yellow taxi whose passenger wasn't built for subtlety. Through the back window, Wolfe's round face hovered in the glass like a disapproving moon. He hadn't left the brownstone in 6 months, but for this, he'd made an exception, and a statement. He was watching me, eyes narrowed, one pudgy finger resting against the pane. When that finger tapped twice, it meant hold. When it tapped once, it meant spring. He waited until Clara had edged just close enough, her attention split between me and her confederate in grey. Then the finger flicked, a small, delicate motion, almost disdainful. I didn't need a semaphore manual. That was the signal. Behind him, I glimpsed another figure. The taxi driver Wolfe had hired privately. An off-duty uniform folded neatly on the front seat. If the chessboard was set, Wolfe was about to take his rook. The man in grey moved fast, but I've played this scene before. He lunged for the envelope, shoulder low, arm out, expecting me to recoil. Instead, I pivoted sideways, let his weight do the work, and gave him a gentle nudge that introduced his face to the bench. He grunted, tried again, and found himself staring up at the blue of the afternoon sky. A whistle cut through the air, a sharp, official one, and the hot dog vendor I'd noticed earlier flipped his cart latch and stepped forward, revealing the kind of badge that doesn't come with mustard stains. Police! Hands up! Clara froze. The man stopped struggling. The envelope, Wolfe's precious decoy, fluttered onto the grass. I retrieved it calmly and brushed off a smudge. You might have torn government property, I said to my new acquaintance. Wolfe's cab door opened a moment later. The air shifted. When Nero Wolfe enters a park, even pigeons file for relocation. Clara took one step back, but Wolfe's bulk filled the path before she could make it 2. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Miss Renwick, he said, you are ill-equipped for improvisation. Your accomplice's eagerness has betrayed you. She said nothing, chin high, eyes darting toward the man now cuffed by the cop. The envelope, Wolfe continued, contains no audit. It contains blank paper, but its presence compelled you to act, to confirm the very theft you wished to hide. Her mask slipped, just a fraction. That was enough. Wolfe turned to the officer. You may wish to inform Inspector Kramer that his suicide theory has suffered a fatal wound. Then, to me. Archie, I believe our orchids will require watering. As he turned back toward the cab, the pigeons scattered, Clara trembled, and the park fell still. I followed, envelope under my arm. The trap had sprung, and for the first time in weeks, Wolfe looked alive. When I opened the door to Wolfe's office and ushered them in, It wasn't exactly the cast of a musical comedy. Clara Renwick came first, her lipstick perfect, her shoulders squared like she was walking into a gallery opening, not a reckoning. Evelyn Holt followed, not even pretending to be calm. Her eyes flitted around the room like they were looking for exits that didn't exist. Commissioner Lathrop entered like a man expecting applause. His coat was tailored to conceal, not flatter. He moved with the brand of civic dignity that costs taxpayers about 11 grand a year in bad contracts. And then there was Kramer, Inspector Lon Cohen Kramer of the Homicide Division, New York's patron saint of chronic indigestion, came in last with the look of a man who's already regretting his afternoon. "You'll sit there," I said, pointing to the red armchair for Lathrop. "You, Miss Renwick, to Wolfe's right, Miss Holt next to her, and Kramer, you're a free agent, so long as you don't bite the furniture." Kramer grunted. "This better not be theatre, Goodwin." I ignored him and stepped to my post behind Wolfe's chair. He was already seated, fingers steepled, eyes half-lidded, breathing like a man about to carve truth out of smoke. Wolfe's voice broke the tension not with volume, but with weight. "I dislike repetition," he said, eyes still shut. "But I dislike disorder more. Therefore, I shall now impose coherence upon this jumble, not for pleasure, but for necessity." No one spoke. Evelyn fidgeted with the clasp of her purse. Clara crossed her legs, the heel of one shoe tapping silently in rhythm with her pulse. Lathrop pretended to study the bookshelves. Kramer lit a cigar. Wolfe opened his eyes and regarded us like we were wilting orchids in need of pruning. "Mr. Crane," he began, "died in Bryant Park. It was made to look like suicide. The method, poison. The means, a coffee cup. The motive, the motive, required greater ingenuity to unravel. But we are now in possession of it." He turned slightly toward Lathrop. "The Commissioner will no doubt deny knowledge of any internal audit conducted by Mr. Crane, but I shall demonstrate otherwise. Before that, however, the mechanism." He gestured toward me. "Archie, you will describe what you witnessed in the park." So I did. Slowly, clearly, making sure no one missed the part where Clara stared at the decoy envelope like it contained her last alibi. Wolfe shifted his bulk, which for him was a declaration of emphasis. "The coffee cup," he said, "was the delivery device. Not remarkable in itself. Deadly alkaloids can be masked in hot beverages, especially when taken with cream. What is remarkable is its disappearance. There is no cup, no trace, no fingerprints, no residue, nothing." He turned his eyes to Kramer, who frowned around his cigar. "So you're saying it vanished?" the inspector growled. "No," Wolfe replied. "I am saying it was removed, efficiently and with forethought. Miss Renwick?" Clara didn't flinch. "I've said before, I wasn't near him when he collapsed." Wolfe nodded. "Precisely. You weren't near him, but you were near the coffee vendor. Mr. Goodwin's observations confirm that your path through the park coincided with a brief visit to that stand. The vendor is no longer employed there. I believe you arranged for a cup to be poisoned, handed off to Mr. Crane, and then retrieved moments after he collapsed." Her voice was even. "That's speculation." "It is deduction," Wolfe corrected her. "The absence of the cup is your fingerprint." Kramer looked like he'd swallowed his cigar. Wolfe leaned back, eyelids drooping again, as if the effort of logic weighed more than his own girth. "Now to motive," he said. Mr. Crane, an auditor of some experience, had recently requested archival access to financial statements originating in the Department of Municipal Contracts. He did not report this officially. He did, however, confide in a certain reporter, Mr. Calloway. I saw Evelyn stiffen. Lathrop folded his arms. Clara said nothing. "Miss Renwick," Wolfe continued, "serves as liaison to that department, though her title obfuscates the breadth of her actual authority. She had access to personnel schedules, contract approvals, and, most critically, the names of external partners involved in city renovations, including the East River sewage diversion, which mysteriously overran its budget by $1.4 million. That number landed like a dropped anvil. Crane had found the missing funds, Wolfe said quietly. He had not traced them to you, Commissioner, but to the shell companies funneled through Clara Renwick. Whether you knew or not is immaterial for this analysis. What matters is that she knew he knew, and killed to ensure it stayed buried. Clara stood, trembling but defiant. You can't prove that. Wolfe blinked once. Not yet, but the pattern fits. And now, Miss Holt, your part in this tragedy awaits clarification. Wolfe didn't pause to sip beer or admire syntax. He went on, voice level as a plumb line. And then, he said, Mr. Calloway died. A separate event in space, not in sequence. Lathrop stirred. Evelyn swallowed hard. Clara crossed her arms. Her fingers clenched just slightly at the elbow. Wolfe's eyes remained half-lidded. Mr. Calloway, he said, was not only privy to Mr. Crane's suspicions, he was also in possession of corroborating documents, copies of municipal transfer ledgers, routing instructions, bank drafts, enough in sum to confirm the graft. He intended to publish. I nodded. That matched what I'd found tucked in the lining of Calloway's satchel. Wolfe hadn't needed to see them himself. He miscalculated, Wolfe continued. He assumed Miss Renwick would bribe him to silence, but he had already accepted money from another source, Miss Holt, who feared her name might appear in the story. When Clara learned this, her path narrowed. He opened his hand like it held inevitability. She could not threaten Calloway. She could not outbid him. She could not control him. Only one option remained, I said, and she chose it. Clara didn't blink. She poisoned him, Wolfe said, almost gently, because blackmail is fragile and secrets rot when light touches them. She would not have confessed, Wolfe said, folding his hands, had she not sensed unraveling. The envelope was the lever. That was my cue. It wasn't from Crane, I said, and it didn't contain anything but blank paper and a strand of monogrammed ribbon. But it did its job. Wolfe nodded. Mr. Goodwin carried it through the park deliberately, letting it be seen. Miss Renwick's reaction was precise. She halted mid-step, tightened her grip on her handbag, and altered her route. She then signalled. To a man near the coffee stand, I filled in. Brown coat, stiff collar, gone 30 seconds later. Kramer grunted. We're looking for him. Wolfe lifted a brow. He was irrelevant the moment Miss Renwick decided to intervene. Her signal had failed. She had to ensure the envelope was recovered, or neutralized. He shifted slightly in his chair. What betrays guilt more than fear? She left her carefully curated position on the periphery of the scene and approached the bench. That was the tell. She wanted the envelope, I added, but saw it wasn't the one she feared and got spooked. Wolfe's eyes closed, and in that moment, she chose to flee rather than frame a new lie. It was ironically her most honest act. Kramer's patience, which had the lifespan of a fruit fly on a radiator, hit the wall. I don't arrest on poetry, he snapped. You've got a theory, Wolfe, not a body with her name on it. 2 bodies, I offered. Crane and Calloway. He turned on me like I'd insulted his badge. 2 bodies and a disappearing coffee cup. You want me to take that to a judge? Wolfe opened his eyes and met Kramer's frustration with the tranquil contempt of a man debating whether the mustard had been too bold at lunch. You have motive, he said, in the exposure of systematic fraud. You have means, in Miss Renwick's access to the poison and delivery mechanisms. You have opportunity in her movements before and after both deaths. You have behavior inconsistent with innocence, intervention, flight, and silence. Kramer shifted the cigar in his teeth. Still circumstantial. And cumulative, Wolfe replied, which, in our judicial system, may constitute probable cause. Unless, of course, you believe her recent purchase of a train ticket to Montreal was merely recreational. That got him. He exhaled through his nose and turned toward Clara, who hadn't moved in 5 minutes. You ready to talk? He asked. She was, but not to him. Clara finally spoke, her voice lower than I'd heard it, almost intimate. "You think you've cornered me," she said. "You've built a narrative and you want me to complete it. But truth isn't geometry, Mr. Wolfe." Wolfe inclined his head. "It is in this room, and the angles no longer permit ambiguity." Her lips pressed together. The defiance was still there, but dimmer now, dulled by something less performative. "I didn't plan to kill either of them," she said, eyes fixed on some far-off regret. "Not at first. I wanted silence. I wanted time. That envelope you staged, it took the ground out from under me." "And Calloway?" Wolfe asked. Her voice cooled. "He was never interested in justice, just headlines. His kind always thinks they're safe, that they can play with lives like cards and never get dealt one in return." Wolfe's tone was still, almost sorrowful. "And so you struck before the story could, as with Crane." Clara looked at Kramer, then at me, then back at Wolfe. "I suppose you'll want a signed confession." "No," Wolfe said. "Mr. Kramer will want that. I merely wanted to hear you say it." She nodded once. Not defeated, just unmasked. With Clara safely in Kramer's hands and the front door's deadbolt clicked home like punctuation on a confession, the brownstone exhaled. Wolfe returned to his chair, that blasted throne of inertia and indignation, and performed his ritual replanting like he hadn't just flayed a woman's moral hide. He leaned back, fingers steepled, gaze somewhere above the bookshelf where the shadows always seem to gather after a job's done. I perched on the arm of the red chair, letting the hush settle. There's a peculiar stillness that walks in after a big case, the kind that hums behind the ticking clock and makes you notice the rustle of curtains. We weren't used to applause around here, but this ending had felt especially quiet. No headlines, no handshakes, just silence and the faint smell of orchids and closure. Wolfe didn't speak, neither did I, but I knew his thoughts were stirring like beer before the foam breaks. Wolfe broke the spell with a sigh that might have rattled a less secure ceiling. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, voice buttery and cool, "our culture's moral rot does not fester in darkness. It strolls in daylight, wearing linen suits and misquoting Keats." I blinked. "You saying murder's moved uptown?" "No," he replied. "It never left. Bryant Park, benches littered with crumbs, poetry readings, the illusion of gentility. It is an ideal stage. Evil no longer lurks. It lunches." He closed his eyes and breathed through his nose like the world offended it. I tossed a look out the window. Somewhere east of us, Bryant Park lay serene and smug, hiding ghosts behind its shrubbery. Crane and Calloway had shared the same stage, played their parts in this city's endless tragicomedy, and now, one was in a drawer and the other on her way to a cell. "Poets and pigeons," I muttered. Wolfe opened one eye. "Precisely." And with that, he tilted his head, offering civilization his usual disdain and a dash of indigestion. I stayed quiet, which for me is rarer than a cabbie using his turn signal. But there was something about that line, "evil lunches," that hung in the air like the perfume of a woman you can't quite trust. Tomorrow morning, Bryant Park would look the same. The pigeons would strut, the poets would pose, and somewhere, someone would sip a latte 3 feet from where blood had dripped onto the gravel. And no one would know. Or worse, they'd pretend not to. But I'd know. Wolfe would too, though he'd prefer a different kind of bench, walnut, cushioned, preferably not haunted. 2 ghosts. Crane, who died for wanting the truth. Calloway, who killed to keep it tidy. I didn't believe in spectres, but I've learned that memory has teeth, and benches don't forget where betrayal sat. Fritz appeared, punctual as a Swiss confession, with a silver tray and a pair of cold bottles beaded in sweat. The man could have brought in arsenic with parsley garnish and still gotten a nod from Wolfe. Wolfe poured. No toast, no speech, just a pour, a sip, and a grunt that could have meant thank you or go to hell. I lifted my glass and clinked his, lightly, more out of rhythm than ritual. "Here's to truth," I offered. Wolfe's lip curled. "Pfui." He took another sip. Truth arrives as all unwelcome guests do, late and lacking civility. That was Wolfe at his most sentimental. I didn't press. The beer was good, cold, dark, and blunt, the opposite of our usual clients. "I suppose," I said, "there's some comfort in knowing the killer was predictable." "There is no comfort," Wolfe muttered. "Only digestion. And tonight, even that is reluctant." He took another sip and closed his eyes. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, that same old cracked plaster that's seen more confessions than a priest with good lighting. Wolfe sipped, I thought. "You know," I said, "City Hall's pigeons probably shared breadcrumbs with Calloway. Bet she never tipped." Wolfe raised a brow. "Flippancy is not a disinfectant." "Neither is moral outrage," I shot back. "But you're right. Nobody's getting a medal for this one. Just 2 lines in the paper and maybe a column inch of remorse." He didn't answer. I shifted in my seat and grinned a little. Still, I'll take it. A rap's a rap. But something itched under my collar. The kind of itch you don't scratch, just live with. Not every story ends with a ticker tape parade. Some just fade into the footnotes, quiet and unfinished. Justice, when it came, didn't always arrive on horseback. Sometimes it tiptoed in after dinner. Wolfe drained his glass, then eyed the bottle as though it had wronged him. "You will close the windows, Mr. Goodwin. The city's conscience is howling tonight, and I have no appetite for it." I smirked. "That loud, huh?" He didn't respond, just leaned back, hands folding over his belly like a banker sealing a vault. "Foy," he said. One word, one syllable, it carried the weight of a verdict. I took that as my cue and got up, crossing the room to snap the windows shut. Outside, Manhattan sulked in its usual mix of foghorns, sirens, and bad jazz. The city that never slept just muttered in its sleep. Anything else before I vanish into the streets of moral decay? No. I turned at the door. "Tomorrow," Wolfe said without looking, "bring me the New York Times, not the Gazette. The Gazette editorializes like a child with a crayon." I nodded. "Right, no crayons." The door clicked behind me, and I stepped into the night. Another case behind us, another ghost in the park. Wolfe had his beer. I had my grin. The city had pigeons, and none of them could spell conscience. In the hush that follows truth, even Manhattan seems to breathe differently. The park will wake tomorrow to its usual rhythm, pigeons, poets, and passers-by, never knowing what shadows were lifted from its benches tonight. Justice, perhaps, has been done, but not the kind that leaves anyone untouched. Wolfe returns to his chair, the city to its noise, and the conscience of both remains unsettled. Do you think Clara acted out of desperation or design? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed the mystery, be sure to like the video, share it with someone who loves detective stories, and subscribe for more. Not every case ends with applause, but the truth, once found, always echoes.